A biased and racist teacher, a classroom full of tension, and a twist that no one saw coming. It's a story that will expose years of hidden prejudice and leave you questioning what really happens behind closed classroom doors. Get ready for a tale of quiet strength, deep-rooted bias, and an unforgettable moment of reckoning that changes everything. It all began in the middle of an ordinary school day at Riverview High. Mrs. Caldwell, a strict and cold English teacher, stood at the front of her classroom, her sharp eyes scanning the rows of students with an air of superiority. She prided herself on maintaining control, but there was a darker side to her methods, one that most of the students knew better than to challenge. That day, however, the balance of power shifted with the arrival of a new student. Aaron Miller walked through the door, his presence quietly commanding despite the awkwardness of being the new kid. His tall frame and determined gaze drew brief glances from his classmates, but one look from Mrs. Caldwell was enough to set the tone for what was to come. "Well, well," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice oozing with fake politeness. "A new addition to our class. Welcome, Mr. Miller. I trust you'll do your best to keep up with our standards here." The way she emphasized standards made it clear she had her doubts. Aaron nodded respectfully and found an empty seat near the back of the room, his expression calm and unreadable. The room, however, was anything but calm. A subtle tension crept in, noticed by a few of the more perceptive students. Mrs. Caldwell's demeanor seemed harsher, her movements more deliberate, and her tone colder than usual. What no one in that classroom could have predicted was that this seemingly ordinary day would spark a chain of events leading to an explosive confrontation, one that would expose the very heart of Mrs. Caldwell's prejudice and reveal a truth that she never saw coming. For Aaron Miller wasn't just any student, and when his father finally walked through those school doors, everything Mrs. Caldwell thought she knew about power and control would crumble. But for now, the stage was set. Aaron's quiet resilience was about to meet Mrs. Caldwell's unchecked bias in a battle that would test the limits of patience, courage, and justice. What followed would leave the entire school, and Mrs. Caldwell herself, forever changed. The classroom was quiet, save for the faint scratching of pens on paper and the hum of the overhead lights. Mrs. Caldwell stood by the whiteboard, her markers squeaking as she wrote out key themes from To Kill a Mockingbird. Her sharp handwriting matched her personality, precise, uncompromising, and unforgiving. "Now, class," she said, turning to face the students, "this novel is a cornerstone of American literature, and understanding it requires a certain level of intellectual rigor." Her eyes swept across the room, lingering on Aaron Miller as if to silently challenge him. "Let's start with the concept of justice. Who can explain how Harper Lee portrays the theme of justice in the story?" A few hands shot up, but none faster than Aaron's. He straightened in his seat, his confidence quiet but unmistakable. The room tensed as Mrs. Caldwell's gaze landed on him. For a moment, she hesitated, as though deciding whether to call on him at all. Finally, with a tight smile, she said, "Yes, Mr. Miller." Aaron lowered his hand, his voice calm and steady. "I think the theme of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird shows how the legal system can be unfair, especially when it's influenced by racism. The trial of Tom Robinson—" "Stop right there," Mrs. Caldwell interrupted, raising a hand. Her tone was clipped, her smile gone. "While that's a creative interpretation, Mr. Miller, you've already made a fundamental error. This is a discussion about justice, not your personal opinions about the legal system." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged nervous glances while others stared intently at their desks, unwilling to meet Aaron's eyes. The tension was palpable. Aaron blinked, his composure unshaken. "But, Mrs. Caldwell, the trial—" "Mr. Miller." She cut him off again, her voice dripping with condescension. "Let me stop you before you dig yourself a deeper hole. This is a literary analysis, not a platform for political commentary. Perhaps you should listen more carefully to the text before jumping to conclusions." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Aaron's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. He nodded once, picking up his pen and focusing on his notebook. His silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. There was no use in fighting Mrs. Caldwell now. Mrs. Caldwell turned back to the whiteboard, but the air in the room remained thick with unease. The other students were restless, unsure how to respond. Emily, who sat 2 rows ahead of Aaron, glanced back at him with a look of sympathy. She knew Mrs. Caldwell could be harsh, but this felt targeted. As the lesson continued, it became clear that Mrs. Caldwell wasn't done with Aaron. Every time he raised his hand, her eyes flicked past him to someone else. When another student, Alex, echoed one of Aaron's earlier points, Mrs. Caldwell praised it as insightful. The double standard was glaring, and even the less observant students started to notice. "Interesting, Alex," Mrs. Caldwell said with a nod. "That's the kind of critical thinking I'm looking for in this class." She cast a brief glance in Aaron's direction, the corner of her mouth twitching upward in a smirk. Aaron didn't react. His face was calm, his attention focused on his notes, but the subtle clenching of his hand around his pen betrayed his frustration. Later in the lesson, Mrs. Caldwell handed out an in-class exercise. Each student was to write a brief analysis of a key passage from the novel. As Aaron worked diligently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Caldwell prowled the aisles, peering over shoulders and offering feedback. When she reached Aaron, she stopped, her shadow falling over his desk. "Let's see what you've come up with," she said, leaning in and picking up his paper without waiting for permission. She scanned it quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Well," she said loudly, enough for the entire class to hear, "this is ambitious. But unfortunately, Mr. Miller, you've missed the mark. Again." Aaron looked up at her, his expression neutral. "Could you explain what I did wrong?" he asked evenly. Mrs. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. "It's not about what you did wrong, Mr. Miller, it's about what you didn't do. Your analysis is superficial at best. Perhaps you're not accustomed to the level of academic rigor we expect here at Riverview High." The room was deathly silent. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others watched with wide eyes, captivated by the unfolding drama. Aaron took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I'd be happy to revise it," he said, his voice calm. "Could you tell me what specifically needs improvement?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. She wasn't used to students standing their ground, especially not in front of the entire class. "Perhaps if you spent more time listening during discussions and less time interrupting with half-formed ideas, you wouldn't need me to spell it out for you," she said curtly, handing his paper back. Aaron nodded, carefully placing the paper in his folder. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't going to give Mrs. Caldwell the satisfaction of a reaction. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Aaron gathered his things methodically. The other students filed out quickly, eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Emily lingered for a moment, catching Aaron's eye. "Hey," she said quietly, "don't let her get to you." Aaron offered her a small, grateful smile. "I won't," he said simply. But as he walked out of the classroom, his mind was already racing. He knew this wasn't just about him misunderstanding a lesson or Mrs. Caldwell having a bad day. There was something deeper at play, something that wouldn't be solved by staying quiet forever. For now, though, Aaron chose patience. He had a plan, and he wasn't about to let Mrs. Caldwell derail it. The next week, the air in Mrs. Caldwell's class felt heavier than usual. Aaron had started to pick up on the way her sharp gaze always seemed to find him, like a predator waiting for its prey to slip up. Every question she posed to the class came with the unspoken rule that Aaron's participation wasn't welcome. Even when he stayed silent, she managed to find ways to put him under the microscope. "Aaron Miller," she barked one day, just as he was taking his seat. "Is that gum I see in your mouth?" Aaron looked up, startled. "No, ma'am, I don't have any gum." Her eyes narrowed and the corners of her mouth curled into a thin, disbelieving smile. "Are you sure? Because I could have sworn I saw you chewing." "I'm sure," Aaron replied, his voice steady but calm. Mrs. Caldwell crossed her arms and tilted her head, as if daring him to contradict her further. "Stand up, Mr. Miller. Walk to the trash can and spit it out. Now." The entire class went silent. A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Aaron hesitated for a moment, then rose from his desk. His movements were deliberate, almost defiant in their slowness. He walked to the trash can, pantomimed spitting out imaginary gum, and returned to his seat without saying a word. Some students giggled under their breath, their amusement feeding off Mrs. Caldwell's brazen display of authority. Emily, seated a few rows ahead, shifted uncomfortably. She glanced at Aaron, her lips pressed into a thin line, but said nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," Mrs. Caldwell said with a smug smile. "Now, let's hope that's the last time we have to address inappropriate behavior in this classroom." Aaron kept his focus on his notebook, refusing to let her see even a flicker of frustration on his face. But inside, he could feel the anger simmering. A quiet fire he refused to let flare up in front of her. He had learned long ago that people like Mrs. Caldwell fed off reactions. They thrived on the power they felt when they could push someone to their breaking point. He wouldn't give her that. The microaggressions turned more frequent and deliberate as the days went on. Mrs. Caldwell began nitpicking every aspect of Aaron's behavior, from the way he sat in his chair to the way he phrased his answers. One day, during a group discussion, Aaron contributed a thoughtful point about the symbolism of the mockingbird in To Kill a Mockingbird. Mrs. Caldwell interrupted him almost immediately. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "could you please enunciate more clearly? Some of us are having a hard time understanding your dialect." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Even the students who usually laughed along with Mrs. Caldwell seemed stunned by her words. Aaron froze, his hands tightening into fists beneath the desk. He knew exactly what she meant. She wasn't critiquing his clarity, she was taking a dig at his background, his identity. "I thought I was clear," Aaron replied, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Mrs. Caldwell raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by his response. "Perhaps next time, you should focus more on your delivery and less on whatever it is you're trying to say." Aaron said nothing. He refused to let her bait him, but the damage had been done. The classroom atmosphere, already tense, felt suffocating. Emily shot Aaron a sympathetic glance, her expression torn between outrage and hesitation. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, lowering her gaze to her desk. By now, the classroom had split into factions. A handful of students, emboldened by Mrs. Caldwell's behavior, began joining in with snickers and whispered comments whenever she targeted Aaron. Others, like Emily, remained silent, their discomfort growing with every passing day. And then there were the students who pretended not to notice at all, their indifference almost as cutting as the insults themselves. The moments of humiliation piled up. During one class, Mrs. Caldwell assigned a group project, stating, "I'll be choosing the groups. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." Aaron clenched his jaw as she read out the groups, deliberately pairing him with students who often mocked him under their breath. When one of his teammates complained loudly about having to carry the group, Mrs. Caldwell said nothing. Instead, she offered Aaron a thin smile. "I trust you'll work hard to prove yourself, Mr. Miller," she said. "We'll see if you can rise to the occasion." Aaron nodded, swallowing his frustration. "Yes, ma'am," he replied evenly. But the final straw came during another class discussion. As Aaron attempted to explain a point about justice and morality in the novel, Mrs. Caldwell interrupted yet again, this time with a dismissive laugh. "Mr. Miller," she said, shaking her head, "I'm not sure where you're getting your ideas, but they're far from what Harper Lee intended. Perhaps your previous school didn't emphasize critical thinking." Aaron's classmates froze. The insinuation was clear, and it hung in the air like a thick fog. Emily turned to glare at Mrs. Caldwell, her cheeks flushed with anger, but she still didn't speak. A few students glanced at Aaron, their expressions a mixture of pity and discomfort. Aaron, however, refused to flinch. He met Mrs. Caldwell's gaze head-on and said, "Actually, I read that analysis in a scholarly article. I can bring it to class if you'd like." Mrs. Caldwell's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she recovered. "That won't be necessary," she said curtly. "Let's move on." But the damage had already been done, and Aaron knew it. Each insult, each snide remark felt like another weight pressing down on him. Yet he refused to let it break him. He focused on his work, his posture straight and his determination unwavering. For every slight, he channeled his frustration into his studies, knowing that the best way to fight back was to excel in the very environment she was trying to use against him. Still, Aaron couldn't help but feel the isolation creeping in. No one spoke up, not even Emily. And while he understood the fear that kept them silent, it didn't make the silence hurt any less. Mrs. Caldwell's prejudice wasn't just an attack on him, it was a reflection of a deeper, uglier truth about the power she wielded in that classroom. And Aaron knew that sooner or later, something had to give. Aaron sat at his desk after class, his pencil moving methodically across his notebook. The room was almost empty now, except for a few stragglers packing up their things and Mrs. Caldwell shuffling papers at her desk. He didn't have to stay behind, but Aaron found solace in these quiet moments where he could focus without the constant eyes of his peers or the sharp jabs of his teacher's words. He was working on his presentation for the group project, a deep dive into the themes of justice and morality in To Kill a Mockingbird. Aaron had always loved literature, finding it to be a way to explore truths about the world that were often left unspoken. But now his work felt like more than just a school assignment. It was a statement. He wanted to prove, not just to Mrs. Caldwell but to himself, that he wouldn't let her define his worth. Over the next few days, Aaron poured himself into the project. He spent hours in the library, researching scholarly articles and dissecting passages from the novel. He organized his findings meticulously, creating a visual presentation that was clear, insightful, and backed by evidence. His diligence didn't go unnoticed, especially by Emily, who often saw him staying late after school to refine his work. "You're really going all out," she said one afternoon as she passed him in the hallway. Aaron shrugged, offering a small smile. "I want to get it right." Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You're doing great, Aaron. Don't let her get to you." Her words were kind, but they couldn't erase the weight of what he was facing. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't making things easy. Every time Aaron participated in class or submitted an assignment, she found a way to belittle his efforts. One morning, Mrs. Caldwell handed back an essay Aaron had written. It was a piece he'd worked on for days, meticulously crafting each argument and supporting it with textual evidence. But as he flipped through the pages, his stomach sank. The margins were covered in red ink, her comments harsh and dismissive. "This essay lacks depth," she had written. "Your arguments are simplistic, and your analysis is underdeveloped. You'll need to do much better if you want to pass this class." Aaron clenched his jaw, reading the feedback again. He knew the work he had submitted was strong. It wasn't just his opinion. He'd even compared it to essays written by some of his classmates, who had received glowing remarks. The double standard was glaring, but Aaron refused to let it deter him. When Mrs. Caldwell noticed him reviewing her comments, she smirked. "If you'd like, Mr. Miller, I can recommend some remedial resources for writing. It might help you catch up to the rest of the class." Aaron looked up, meeting her gaze with calm determination. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Caldwell. Thank you." His response, measured and polite, seemed to irritate her more than if he'd argued back. She narrowed her eyes but said nothing, returning to her stack of papers. As the date for the group presentations approached, Mrs. Caldwell found more opportunities to undermine Aaron. During one class discussion, she asked a question about the symbolism of the mockingbird in the novel. Aaron raised his hand, confident in his answer, but she ignored him, calling on another student instead. When the student hesitated, unsure of the answer, Mrs. Caldwell turned to Aaron with a pointed look. "Well, Mr. Miller, since you seem so eager, perhaps you can enlighten us." Aaron spoke clearly, explaining how the mockingbird symbolized innocence and the loss of it in a prejudiced society. His voice was steady, his argument well supported, but Mrs. Caldwell cut him off before he could finish. "That's adequate," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "But next time, try to keep your response more concise. We don't have all day." The class shifted uncomfortably. Emily glanced at Aaron, her expression sympathetic, while a few students in the back exchanged smirks. Aaron simply nodded, jotting down a note in his notebook without saying a word. Despite her constant jabs, Aaron's quiet defiance began to speak louder than any argument he could have made. He excelled in every task he was given, no matter how much she tried to downplay his success. When she assigned extra reading for the class, Aaron not only completed it, but came prepared with detailed notes. When she criticized his handwriting on a quiz, he submitted the next one typed, leaving no room for her to nitpick. His resilience didn't just frustrate Mrs. Caldwell. It began to inspire those around him. Emily, who had remained silent for so long, found herself wanting to stand up for him, even if she wasn't sure how. Other students started noticing the unfair treatment more blatantly, their smirks fading as the reality of Mrs. Caldwell's behavior became harder to ignore. Aaron's focus remained on his presentation. He saw it as an opportunity to showcase his hard work, to prove, if only to himself, that he was more than the box Mrs. Caldwell had tried to place him in. He practiced late into the night, rehearsing his points and refining his slides. His family noticed the effort he was putting in, particularly his father, who had always encouraged Aaron to stand tall in the face of adversity. "You're going to do great," his father said one evening as Aaron sat at the dining room table, flipping through his notes. "Just remember, it's not about proving her wrong. It's about showing yourself what you're capable of." Aaron nodded, his father's words sinking in. He wasn't doing this for Mrs. Caldwell. He was doing it for himself, for the future he wanted, and for the person he knew he was capable of becoming. The night before the presentation, Aaron carefully packed his materials into his backpack. He felt a mixture of nerves and determination. He knew Mrs. Caldwell would be watching, waiting for any opportunity to tear him down. But he also knew he was ready. This was his moment to show not just his teacher but his classmates that he was more than the narrow assumptions made about him. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he took a deep breath. Tomorrow would be another battle, but it was one he was prepared to fight. And no matter what Mrs. Caldwell said or did, Aaron had already decided one thing. He wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The day of the presentations arrived, and the classroom buzzed with nervous energy. Groups huddled together, flipping through their notes and making last-minute adjustments to their visuals. The faint hum of a projector filled the room as students practiced under their breath, their voices trembling with anticipation. But Aaron sat quietly at his desk, his materials neatly organized and his expression calm. He had spent countless hours preparing, and while the stakes felt high, he was ready to deliver. Mrs. Caldwell clapped her hands to silence the class. "All right, everyone, let's get started. Remember, this is a chance to demonstrate your understanding of not just the novel, but also how to present ideas clearly and concisely. I'll be grading on depth of analysis, presentation skills, and of course effort." Her eyes landed on Aaron for a fraction of a second, her smile sharpening. Let's see who rises to the occasion. One by one, the groups presented their projects. Each met with polite applause and occasional critique from Mrs. Caldwell. She nodded approvingly at some and offered gentle corrections to others, but the atmosphere remained supportive until it was Aaron's turn. "Next up," Mrs. Caldwell announced, barely masking her disinterest, "we have Mr. Miller and his group." Aaron stood, carrying his presentation board to the front of the room. His teammates followed reluctantly, shuffling behind him, clearly intimidated by the prospect of being graded under Mrs. Caldwell's watchful eye. Aaron placed his board front and center, the title boldly reading, "Equality and Justice in To Kill a Mockingbird." He turned to face the class, his hands steady as he began. "Our project focuses on how Harper Lee uses the trial of Tom Robinson to highlight systemic injustice and racial inequality. Through her portrayal of the characters in the town of Macomb, Lee reveals how prejudice corrupts the legal system and society as a whole." The class listened intently, their earlier nervousness giving way to interest. Aaron spoke with clarity and confidence, weaving together evidence from the text with insights from his research. His analysis was sharp, his points well supported. Even some of the students who had previously snickered at him now seemed impressed, nodding along as he spoke. But Mrs. Caldwell's expression remained icy. Her pen tapped rhythmically against her clipboard, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The longer Aaron spoke, the more her discomfort became apparent. She shifted in her chair, her mouth tightening into a thin line. When Aaron paused to allow his teammates to contribute, Mrs. Caldwell seized the moment. "Mr. Miller," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a knife, "while your effort is commendable, I must say your focus on these so-called systemic issues feels misplaced. Harper Lee's work is a product of its time. It's not meant to be dissected through the lens of modern-day political agendas." The room fell silent. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. Aaron stood his ground, his posture straight and his expression calm. "With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, the book's themes of racial injustice are central to its narrative. Harper Lee herself—" Mrs. Caldwell raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "That's enough, Mr. Miller. We don't need a history lesson on your interpretation of the text. Perhaps your time would have been better spent focusing on the universal themes rather than narrowing your scope to a single issue." The implication in her words was clear, and it hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Aaron's teammates fidgeted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. Emily, sitting in the front row, looked outraged, her hands clenched into fists on her desk. But no one said anything. Aaron took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the tension. The universal themes of the novel are rooted in its depiction of racial injustice. Ignoring that would be ignoring the heart of the story. Mrs. Caldwell's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. Is that so? Well, Mr. Miller, perhaps you're simply unable to grasp the broader literary merit of the novel. Not everything has to be about race, you know. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Some students gasped audibly, while others stared at Mrs. Caldwell in disbelief. Even those who had previously sided with her looked stunned. The mask of professionalism she usually wore had slipped, revealing the ugliness beneath. Aaron's hands clenched at his sides, but he refused to let his anger show. He locked eyes with Mrs. Caldwell, his voice firm. With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, the novel is about race. That's not my interpretation, it's the author's intent, and I think it's important we acknowledge that. For a moment, the room was silent. Mrs. Caldwell's face reddened, her composure cracking under the weight of the tension. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The class watched, captivated, as Aaron stood his ground, his quiet defiance speaking louder than anything else. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell cleared her throat. "Let's move on," she said curtly, her voice shaking slightly. "We've spent enough time on this. Thank you, Mr. Miller. You may sit down." Aaron nodded, his face calm as he gathered his materials and returned to his seat. But inside, his heart was racing. He could feel the weight of his classmates' eyes on him, some filled with admiration, others with shame for their silence. Emily turned in her seat to whisper, "That was brave." Aaron gave her a small smile but said nothing. He didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted. Still, he knew he had done the right thing. Mrs. Caldwell's words had exposed her true colors, and there was no taking them back. As the class continued, the atmosphere remained tense. Mrs. Caldwell's critiques of the remaining presentations were short and clipped, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. But the damage had already been done. The classroom dynamic had shifted, and for the first time it was clear that Mrs. Caldwell's authority was no longer absolute. Aaron sat quietly, his mind replaying the confrontation. He hadn't set out to provoke her, but he couldn't let her words go unchallenged. He didn't know what the fallout would be, but he was prepared to face it. This was no longer just about a grade or a presentation. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it came at a cost. After class, Aaron lingered at his desk, slowly gathering his materials. The other students filed out in small clusters, their conversations hushed and uncertain. The events of the presentation had left a mark, and even those who usually stayed neutral seemed shaken by what they had witnessed. Emily waited by the door, her expression unreadable as she watched Aaron carefully place his presentation board into his backpack. When the room had finally emptied, save for the two of them, Emily walked over. "Hey," she said softly, "you okay?" Aaron looked up, his eyes betraying the exhaustion he was trying to hide. "I'm fine," he said, though the tightness in his voice said otherwise. Emily sat down in the desk next to him, leaning forward. "Aaron, what happened in there wasn't fine. What she said, it was out of line, completely out of line." Aaron let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, it's not the first time. Probably won't be the last either." Emily's brows furrowed. "That doesn't mean it's okay. You know that, right?" He shrugged, zipping up his bag. "What am I supposed to do? It's her word against mine." and she's the teacher. Who's going to listen to me?" Emily leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Your parents would listen. Aaron, you have to tell them what's been going on. This isn't just about today, it's about everything. She's been targeting you for weeks." Aaron hesitated, his hand resting on the strap of his bag. He wanted to believe that speaking up would make a difference, but he couldn't shake the fear that it might make things worse. Mrs. Caldwell held so much power in that classroom, and the thought of challenging her felt daunting. "I don't know, Emily," he said finally. "What if it backfires? What if she finds out and makes my life even harder?" Emily's eyes softened. "She's already making your life hard, and she's getting away with it because no one's holding her accountable. You don't have to deal with this alone, Aaron. Let your parents help you." Aaron sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew Emily was right, but the thought of reliving everything, every insult, every dismissal, every pointed comment, was overwhelming. Still, the memory of Mrs. Caldwell's words during his presentation burned in his mind. She had crossed a line, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll talk to them tonight." Emily smiled, relief washing over her face. "Good, you're doing the right thing." That evening, Aaron sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. His parents, David and Lisa Miller, exchanged a glance, sensing that something was on his mind. "You've been quiet tonight," his father said, setting down his fork. "Everything okay?" Aaron hesitated, his eyes flickering between his parents. He had always admired their strength, his mother's unwavering support, and his father's calm, steady leadership. But now, as he prepared to tell them about Mrs. Caldwell, he felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother leaned forward, concern etched on her face. "What is it, sweetheart?" Aaron took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess himself. "It's about my English teacher, Mrs. Caldwell. She's been treating me differently, targeting me, I guess. And today, during my presentation, she said something racist." The room fell silent. His mother's hand flew to her mouth and his father's expression darkened. "What exactly did she say?" his father asked, his tone calm but firm. Aaron recounted the events of the day, his voice trembling slightly as he relived the humiliation of Mrs. Caldwell's interruptions and her dismissive comments. He explained how her behavior had been building over time, the way she ignored his hand during discussions, nitpicked his work, and made subtle digs about his background. By the time he finished, his mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Aaron," she said, her voice breaking, "why didn't you tell us sooner?" "I didn't want to make a big deal out of it," Aaron admitted. "I thought I could handle it, and I was scared that if I said something it would only make things worse." His father leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "Son, I understand why you'd feel that way, but this isn't something you should have to handle on your own. No teacher has the right to treat you like that." Aaron looked down at his hands. "What if nothing changes? What if I just make her hate me more?" His father reached across the table, placing a hand on Aaron's shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk, but you're not alone in this. Your mom and I will be with you every step of the way." His mother nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll talk to the school. They need to know what's been happening." Aaron felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Part of him was grateful for their support, but another part feared what might come next. He had seen what happened to other students who stood up to authority, They were often dismissed, their concerns brushed aside. But as he looked at his parents, their strength gave him a spark of hope. "Okay," he said finally, "let's do it." The next morning, Aaron's parents called the school to request a meeting with the principal. Aaron couldn't help but feel a flicker of nerves as he walked into class that day, knowing that Mrs. Caldwell was oblivious to what was coming. She greeted the class with her usual coldness, her eyes briefly settling on Aaron before moving on. But Aaron felt different now. He wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control over the situation. His parents believed in him, and for now, that was enough to keep him going. As the day went on, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know how the school would respond or what Mrs. Caldwell's reaction would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He was done staying silent. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Mrs. Caldwell had called it under the pretense of discussing Aaron's behavior, a thinly veiled excuse to justify her treatment of him. She felt confident as she prepared for the meeting, carefully arranging her notes and rehearsing her words. She had dealt with difficult students before, and as far as she was concerned, Aaron Miller was just another one of those problematic cases. This meeting was merely a formality to secure parental agreement on her authority. Aaron sat quietly in class that day, knowing full well what was happening behind the scenes. He had overheard Mrs. Caldwell muttering to herself about the meeting during homeroom. The glint in her eye told him she was planning to use this as an opportunity to cement her dominance. What Mrs. Caldwell didn't know was that Aaron's father, David Miller, wasn't just any concerned parent. He was a respected civil rights attorney, known in the community for his unwavering stance on equality and justice. As the time for the meeting approached, Mrs. Caldwell sat in the small conference room adjacent to her classroom. She glanced at her watch, impatient for Aaron's parents to arrive. She had even prepared a few examples of Aaron's disruptive behavior, cherry-picking moments to make him appear uncooperative. Her plan was simple: paint Aaron as a troubled student and convince his parents that her strict methods were in his best interest. The door opened, and Mrs. Caldwell looked up, her practiced smile firmly in place. In walked Lisa Miller, Aaron's mother, her presence warm but resolute. Mrs. Caldwell rose to greet her, but before she could speak, another figure stepped into the room. David Miller followed closely behind, his tall frame and composed demeanor commanding the space. He wore a tailored suit and carried an air of quiet authority that immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. "Good afternoon," Mr. Miller said, his voice calm but firm as he extended a hand. Mrs. Caldwell hesitated for a moment, her confidence faltering as she shook his hand. "Good afternoon. Thank you both for coming. Please have a seat." The Millers sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. Mrs. Caldwell felt a flicker of unease but quickly dismissed it. She cleared her throat, opening the folder in front of her. "I wanted to discuss some concerns regarding Aaron's performance and behavior in my class." Lisa leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowing. "Concerns? Could you elaborate on that?" Mrs. Caldwell nodded, her tone dripping with practiced professionalism. "Of course. While Aaron is clearly intelligent, he often challenges my authority during discussions, frequently interrupting the flow of the lesson. Additionally, his recent presentation lacked focus on the broader themes of the novel, and instead fixated on certain topics that I felt were not appropriate for the classroom." David Miller's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. "I see," he said evenly. "And when you say Aaron challenges your authority, could you provide specific examples?" Mrs. Caldwell paused, clearly caught off guard. "Well, there have been multiple occasions where he's interrupted to offer his opinions on the material, sometimes steering the conversation in a direction that distracts from the curriculum. "So," David said, his tone measured, "you're saying Aaron is actively engaging in the classroom discussion. Isn't that the point of education? To encourage critical thinking and dialogue?" Mrs. Caldwell flushed slightly, but maintained her composure. "Of course, but there's a fine line between engagement and disruption. I believe Aaron's focus on certain themes has created tension among the other students." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "By certain themes, are you referring to his analysis of racial inequality in To Kill a Mockingbird?" Mrs. Caldwell's face tightened. "Well, yes, but that's not the only issue. My concern is that Aaron's approach is, how do I put this, narrow-minded. The novel offers many universal themes, and I worry that he's missing the bigger picture." David's voice was calm, but carried a weight that made Mrs. Caldwell shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Mrs. Caldwell, let's be honest. Are you suggesting that discussing racial inequality, a central theme of the book, is somehow inappropriate? Or are you implying that Aaron's perspective is unwelcome in your classroom?" Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, her confidence cracking under the pressure. I never said that. I simply believe the discussion should remain objective and not veer into personal or political territory." David leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "With all due respect, Mrs. Caldwell, you've just admitted to dismissing a valid analysis because it made you uncomfortable. My son isn't the one steering the conversation off course. You are." The room fell silent. Mrs. Caldwell's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. She opened her mouth to respond, but Lisa spoke first. "Let's not forget the comments you made during Aaron's presentation," Lisa said, her voice sharp. "You implied that he was incapable of understanding broader literary themes and even questioned the education he received before attending your class. That wasn't just dismissive, it was insulting." Mrs. Caldwell paled, her earlier confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. I may have misspoken." David's gaze didn't waver. "No, you didn't. Your words and actions have made it clear that you've singled out Aaron, not because of his performance, but because of your own biases. This isn't just about one comment or one class. This is about a pattern of behavior that has created a hostile learning environment for my son." Mrs. Caldwell shifted in her seat, her hands gripping the edges of her folder. "I assure you that was never my intention. I hold all my students to the same high standards." "Do you?" David interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "Because it seems to me that Aaron's work is scrutinized more harshly than his peers. And let's not pretend your tone and comments haven't been different with him. Intention or not, your actions have sent a clear message." Mrs. Caldwell opened and closed her mouth, searching for a defense but finding none. The weight of David's words and the quiet resolve in Lisa's eyes left her no room to maneuver. "We're not here to debate your intentions, Mrs. Caldwell," Lisa said, her voice firm. "We're here to ensure that Aaron is treated fairly and with the respect he deserves. If this behavior continues, we will take this matter to the school board." The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Caldwell looked between the two of them, her carefully maintained composure now shattered. She forced a tight smile, her voice trembling slightly. "I appreciate your feedback. I'll take this into consideration moving forward." David stood, his presence towering over the table. "Good, because I expect a classroom where my son, and every other student, is encouraged to learn and grow, not dismissed or belittled. We'll be watching." With that, he extended a hand, which Mrs. Caldwell shook reluctantly. As the Millers left the room, Mrs. Caldwell slumped back in her chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. For the first time, her authority had been truly challenged, and she had no idea what the fallout would be. The next morning, the weight of the previous day's meeting hung heavily in Mrs. Caldwell's classroom. She sat at her desk, rifling through papers in a futile attempt to focus, but her thoughts kept returning to the confrontation with Aaron's parents. David Miller's calm yet unyielding demeanor had left her rattled in a way she hadn't experienced before. He had challenged her authority, not with aggression, but with an unwavering clarity that made her usual defenses feel paper-thin. As the first bell rang, signaling the start of the day, Mrs. Caldwell braced herself. She knew the fallout from the meeting wasn't over. She had hoped the Millers' words would stay confined to that small conference room, but something told her this situation wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. She didn't have to wait long to find out. During the lunch break, Mrs. Caldwell was called to the principal's office. The tone of the summons was neutral but firm, and as she made her way down the corridor, her stomach churned. She walked into the office to find David Miller already seated across from Principal Carter, his presence as commanding as ever. Principal Carter gestured for her to sit, his expression serious. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "Mr. Miller has brought some serious concerns to my attention regarding your treatment of his son, Aaron." Mrs. Caldwell stiffened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "I assure you, Principal Carter, there's been a misunderstanding. I hold all my students to the same standards." "Do you?" David interrupted, his tone calm but piercing. "Because based on what I've observed and what Aaron has shared, it seems your standards are selectively applied." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes darted to Principal Carter, searching for support, but his expression remained neutral. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her footing. "I believe Aaron may have misinterpreted my teaching methods. I'm firm but fair with all my students." David leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Let's discuss these teaching methods, shall we? Like the time you ignored Aaron's raised hand during class discussions, only to praise another student for offering the same point minutes later. Or when you publicly dismissed his presentation as narrow-minded despite its depth and thorough research." Mrs. Caldwell flushed, her composure starting to crack. I was simply encouraging him to broaden his perspective. It's part of my job to challenge my students." "Challenging them is one thing," David said, his voice rising slightly, "but dismissing them, belittling them, and questioning their abilities because of preconceived notions is another. And let's not forget the comments you made about Aaron's previous education being lacking. What exactly were you implying?" Mrs. Caldwell faltered, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for a response. "I didn't mean—" "Let's be clear," David cut in, his tone unwavering. "You didn't just question his education. You questioned his intelligence, his abilities, and his right to be treated with the same respect as every other student in that classroom. And you did it in front of his peers, undermining his confidence and isolating him." Principal Carter leaned forward, his expression stern. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've reviewed Aaron's academic record. He's one of the top-performing students in his grade. There's no justification for the concerns you've raised about his abilities." Mrs. Caldwell felt the walls closing in. She looked down at her hands, her carefully constructed defenses unraveling. I didn't realize my comments had been taken that way. I never intended to hurt Aaron." David's eyes narrowed. "Intent doesn't erase impact, Mrs. Caldwell. Your actions have created a hostile environment for my son, a place where he feels targeted and unwelcome. Whether or not you intended it, that's the reality you've created." The room fell silent, the weight of David's words settling over them. Mrs. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the full scope of her actions laid bare. "I'd like to understand one thing," Principal Carter said, breaking the silence. "Why did you feel it was appropriate to downplay Aaron's analysis during his presentation? From what I've seen, his work was well-researched and aligned with the themes of the novel." Mrs. Caldwell hesitated, the question hitting too close to the truth. I thought he was focusing too much on one aspect of the novel. I wanted to encourage him to consider a broader interpretation." David's voice cut through her explanation like a knife. "No, what you wanted was to silence him. You dismissed his analysis because it made you uncomfortable. You couldn't handle the fact that he was right, because admitting that would mean confronting your own biases." Mrs. Caldwell's face turned red, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not fair. I've taught for years, and I've always treated my students equally." "Have you?" David asked, his tone sharp. "Because your actions suggest otherwise. You didn't just dismiss Aaron's work, you undermined him at every turn. And you didn't just fail him as a teacher. You failed the rest of the class by modeling prejudice instead of fairness." Principal Carter's gaze hardened as he turned to Mrs. Caldwell. "These are serious allegations, and based on what I've heard, they're not unfounded. This behavior is unacceptable, and it's not what we stand for as a school. We'll need to conduct a full review of your conduct in the classroom." Mrs. Caldwell's heart sank. Her confidence completely eroded. She opened her mouth to protest but found herself at a loss for words. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no escaping it. David stood, his presence commanding as he addressed the room one final time. "My son deserves a safe, supportive environment where he can thrive, just like every other student in that school. I trust that this matter will be handled appropriately." Principal Carter nodded. "You have my word, Mr. Miller. We take these concerns very seriously." As David walked out of the office, his footsteps steady and purposeful, Mrs. Caldwell sat frozen in her chair. For the first time, she realized that her actions had consequences. Consequences she could no longer avoid. The fallout from the confrontation between Mr. Miller, Principal Carter, and Mrs. Caldwell spread quickly through Riverview High. By the end of the school day, whispers of what had happened in the principal's office were circulating in every hallway. Students who had sat silently in Mrs. Caldwell's class began to talk, emboldened by the possibility that someone was finally holding her accountable. The tension that had long simmered beneath the surface was now boiling over. That evening, Principal Carter called an emergency meeting with the school board to address the complaints. David Miller's allegations weren't just a wake-up call, they were a demand for immediate action. Carter had no choice but to respond decisively. The next morning, the school board convened in the large conference room, its atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Parents, teachers, and administrators filled the space, their murmured conversations underscoring the seriousness of the situation. At the center of it all was Mrs. Caldwell, sitting stiffly in a chair near the front. Her usual confidence was absent, replaced by a strained attempt to maintain composure. David Miller arrived with Lisa and Aaron by his side. Aaron's presence in the room was a silent but powerful reminder of what this meeting was about. As the Millers took their seats, more students began to filter in, some accompanied by their parents. Emily was among them, her usually quiet demeanor replaced by a look of determination. Principal Carter opened the meeting, his tone measured but firm. "We are here today to address serious allegations against Mrs. Caldwell, a longtime educator at Riverview High. These allegations center around behavior that undermines the inclusive and supportive environment we strive to create for all students." He turned to Mrs. Caldwell, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Caldwell, you will have the opportunity to address these concerns. But first, we will hear from those who have come forward. The first to speak was David Miller. Standing at the podium, he recounted the weeks of mistreatment Aaron had endured, carefully detailing every instance of bias and discrimination. His words were precise, his tone calm, but the weight of his accusations was undeniable. Aaron was targeted not because of his performance, but because of his identity. David said, his voice resonating through the room. Mrs. Caldwell dismissed his contributions, undermined his confidence, and used her position of authority to reinforce harmful biases. This is not just a failure of one teacher, it's a failure of the system that allowed her behavior to go unchecked. When David finished, the room was silent, the gravity of his words hanging heavy in the air. Principal Carter nodded, then invited others to speak. Emily was the next to stand. Her voice trembled slightly as she described what she had witnessed in class. I've seen Mrs. Caldwell ignore Aaron's hand during discussions. I've seen her interrupt him and make comments that felt wrong. At the time, I didn't know what to do, so I stayed quiet. But now, I realized that staying silent was part of the problem. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from other students in the room. One by one, more students came forward to share their experiences. Some recounted similar treatment directed at them, while others described witnessing patterns of bias and how Mrs. Caldwell treated students of color compared to their peers. She always nitpicked my work, no matter how hard I tried, said a boy named Marcus, his voice tinged with frustration. It felt like nothing I did was ever good enough. Another student, Nadia, added, she told me my accent made it hard for her to understand me. I didn't think I could say anything because she was the teacher. Each testimony painted a damning picture of Mrs. Caldwell's classroom, a place where prejudice had thrived under the guise of discipline and academic rigor. By the time the final student spoke, the room was buzzing with a mixture of anger and determination. When it was finally Mrs. Caldwell's turn to respond, she stood slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I've always prided myself on being a fair and dedicated teacher, she began, her voice shaky. If my actions have been misinterpreted, or if I've unintentionally hurt anyone, I deeply regret that. But I maintain that my intentions were always to challenge my students to think critically and to meet high standards. Her words, however, did little to sway the room. The testimonies had been too numerous, too specific to dismiss as mere misunderstandings. Principal Carter exchanged a glance with the school board members, who nodded in unison. He turned back to Mrs. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, his tone formal, the evidence presented today is clear. Your behavior has violated the trust placed in you as an educator. Effective immediately, you will be placed on administrative leave while the school board completes its investigation. Pending the outcome, further actions may include termination of your employment. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a heavy silence. Mrs. Caldwell's face went pale, and she sank back into her chair, her carefully constructed facade finally crumbling. As the meeting concluded, the mood in the room shifted. Parents and students began to talk openly about the changes they wanted to see: more diversity training for teachers, stronger policies against discrimination, and better support systems for students who experienced bias. The incident had sparked a reckoning, and the community was determined to ensure that no student would endure what Aaron had. Outside the conference room, Aaron stood with his parents, the weight on his shoulders beginning to lift. Emily approached him, a shy smile on her face. "You did it," she said quietly. "You made a difference." Aaron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all did." As they walked out of the school, the sun breaking through the clouds, Aaron felt a sense of resolution. Justice had been set in motion, and while there was still work to be done, he knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight for equality. In the weeks that followed Mrs. Caldwell's departure, a palpable shift occurred within the halls of Riverview High. The atmosphere felt lighter, more open, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire school community. Students who had once moved through the corridors with eyes downcast now walked with a renewed sense of purpose, and at the center of this transformation was Aaron. On his first day back in English class, Aaron entered the room to find his classmates already seated. The usual chatter fell silent as he approached his desk. For a moment, he wondered if things had truly changed, or if he was about to face another form of isolation. But then Emily stood up, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Hey, Aaron," she said brightly, "we saved you a seat up front." He glanced around, noticing that several desks had been rearranged to create a welcoming space near the front of the class. Other students nodded and waved, their expressions inviting. Surprised, but pleased, Aaron took the offered seat. "Thanks," he replied, a hint of gratitude in his voice. The new substitute teacher, Mrs. Thompson, entered the room carrying a stack of books. She greeted the class with genuine enthusiasm. "Good morning, everyone. I hope you're ready to dive into some exciting discussions today." As the lesson progressed, Aaron noticed a significant difference. Mrs. Thompson encouraged open dialogue, valuing each student's input. When Aaron raised his hand to share his thoughts on the new reading material, she listened attentively. "That's an excellent point, Aaron," she said. "Your perspective adds valuable depth to our understanding." After class, a group of students gathered around him. Marcus, who had previously kept his distance, stepped forward. "Hey, man, a bunch of us are getting together to study for the history exam. You should join us." Aaron hesitated for a moment, still adjusting to the sudden camaraderie. "Sure, I'd like that," he agreed. Over the next few days, the support continued to grow. Students from different grades and social circles reached out, sharing their own stories and expressing solidarity. They organized lunchtime meetings to discuss ways to promote inclusivity within the school. Aaron found himself at the heart of these conversations, his experiences serving as a catalyst for change. One afternoon, as he and Emily sat under a tree in the courtyard, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, your courage inspired a lot of us," she said. "We realized that staying silent only allows injustice to continue." He looked down, modestly shrugging off the praise. "I just did what I had to do." "It's more than that," Emily insisted. "You've helped us see that we all have a role to play in making things better." News of the students' initiative reached the administration. Impressed by their commitment, Principal Carter called a school-wide assembly. Standing on the auditorium stage, he addressed the gathered students and faculty. "Over the past weeks, we've faced challenges that have tested our community," he began. "But from these challenges, I've witnessed remarkable resilience and a collective desire for positive change." He went on to announce the implementation of new programs aimed at fostering an inclusive environment. "Starting next month, we will introduce diversity workshops and anti-bias training for both staff and students. Our goal is to ensure that Riverview High is a place where everyone feels valued and respected." The auditorium erupted in applause. Aaron glanced around, seeing the enthusiasm on his classmates' faces. For the first time since transferring to the school, he felt a genuine sense of belonging. After the assembly, Principal Carter approached Aaron in the hallway. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "Your willingness to stand up has made a significant impact." Aaron nodded appreciatively. "I couldn't have done it without the support of my friends and family." "Nevertheless," the principal continued, Your actions have set in motion changes that will benefit students for years to come. True to their word, the school began rolling out the new initiatives. Workshops facilitated by experts encouraged open discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Teachers participated in training sessions to address unconscious biases and develop more culturally responsive teaching methods. In classrooms, the curriculum began to reflect a broader range of perspectives. Literature classes explored works by authors from diverse backgrounds, sparking rich conversations among students. History lessons delved deeper into narratives that had previously been glossed over or omitted. The student body embraced these changes with enthusiasm. Clubs and organizations dedicated to cultural awareness and social justice gained momentum. Aaron and his peers organized events celebrating different cultures, fostering a spirit of unity and understanding. One evening, as Aaron prepared to head home, he found a note tucked into his locker. Opening it, he read, "Thank you for making a difference. You've inspired me to use my voice too. Nadia." He smiled, tucking the note into his backpack. Moments like these affirmed that the challenges he had faced were not in vain. At home, Aaron shared his experiences with his parents. Over dinner, they discussed the progress being made at the school. "I'm proud of you," his father said, his eyes reflecting genuine admiration. "You've not only stood up for yourself, but also paved the way for others." His mother reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Your journey has touched so many lives." Aaron looked between them, gratitude swelling in his chest. "I couldn't have done it without your support." As the school year continued, the positive changes became deeply ingrained in the fabric of Riverview High. The once tense and divided atmosphere had transformed into one of collaboration and mutual respect. One day, while walking between classes, Aaron overheard a group of students discussing plans for a community outreach project. They were organizing a mentorship program with a local middle school to support younger students navigating similar challenges. "Count me in," Aaron said, joining the conversation. The students welcomed him enthusiastically. "We were hoping you'd be part of it," one of them replied. "Your leadership has been a real inspiration." In that moment, Aaron realized the full extent of the ripple effect his actions had created. What began as a personal struggle against injustice had evolved into a collective movement toward a more inclusive community. As he headed to his next class, Aaron felt a sense of fulfillment. The road hadn't been easy, but the journey had been worthwhile. He had learned that courage could spark change, that one voice could lead to many, and that standing up for what is right often inspires others to do the same. The future at Riverview High looked brighter than ever, and Aaron knew that together they were building a foundation for lasting positive change. In the quiet moments after school, Aaron often found himself sitting on the bench beneath the big oak tree in the courtyard. It had become a place of reflection for him, a space where he could process everything that had unfolded over the past few months. As the leaves rustled gently in the wind, he thought back to how uncertain he'd felt when he first walked into Mrs. Caldwell's classroom. He had been the new kid, unsure of his place, trying to fit into an environment that seemed determined to reject him. Now, everything felt different. He was different. Aaron didn't just see the challenges he had faced, he saw the strength he had gained by standing up to them. He had learned to speak with conviction, even when his voice trembled. He had discovered that courage wasn't about being unafraid, it was about acting despite fear. And most importantly, he had realized the power of his voice to inspire change, not just for himself, but for others around him. The transformation wasn't immediate. In the beginning, Aaron had felt like he was simply surviving each day, one battle at a time. But as he saw the ripple effects of his actions, his confidence began to grow. He noticed it in small ways at first: the ease with which he spoke up in class, the way his peers gravitated toward him, seeking his input during group projects or discussions. His once quiet demeanor had been replaced by a calm assurance that commanded respect. One afternoon, Emily caught up with him after class, a wide grin on her face. "You know, you've become kind of a celebrity around here," she teased. Aaron chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not sure about that." "I'm serious," she insisted. "People look up to you now. They see what you've done, and it makes them think they can do the same." Aaron paused, considering her words. He had never set out to be a role model, but he couldn't deny that others were watching him, taking cues from how he handled himself. It was a responsibility he hadn't expected, but one he was beginning to embrace. One day, during a school assembly, Principal Carter invited Aaron to speak about his experiences. The announcement came as a surprise, and Aaron initially hesitated. The idea of standing in front of the entire school was daunting, even for someone who had faced down a teacher's prejudice. But after some encouragement from his parents and friends, he decided to take the opportunity. The day of the assembly arrived, and as Aaron stepped onto the stage, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium as he looked out at the sea of faces. His classmates, teachers, and even the younger students sat quietly, waiting to hear what he had to say. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady but earnest. "When I first came to Riverview High, I didn't know what to expect. I hoped to make friends, to learn, and to find my place, but instead, I faced challenges I never saw coming. I was made to feel like my voice didn't matter, like who I was didn't belong." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But what I've learned is that when you feel silenced, the most powerful thing you can do is to speak up. It's not easy, and it's not always comfortable, but it's necessary." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. Encouraged by their attention, Aaron continued, "Standing up for yourself doesn't just change your situation. It can change the environment around you. It can inspire others to speak out, to listen, and to grow. And that's how we make things better. Not by waiting for someone else to fix the problem, but by being the ones to start the change." When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. Aaron felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him as he stepped off the stage. Principal Carter gave him an approving nod, and several students approached him afterward to thank him for his words. Outside the assembly, Aaron's newfound confidence began to extend beyond the classroom. He became involved in the mentorship program that had grown out of the school's diversity initiatives, working with younger students to help them navigate challenges and build their own sense of self-worth. He shared his story openly, encouraging them to embrace their identities and speak up for what they believed in. "Aaron, how did you stay so calm when things got hard?" one 8th grader asked during a mentorship session. Aaron smiled thoughtfully. "I wasn't always calm," he admitted. "There were days when I was angry or scared, but I learned that the best way to deal with those feelings was to focus on what I could control: my actions, my words, and how I responded. When you stay true to yourself, no one can take that away from you." The students listened intently, their admiration for him clear. Aaron realized in those moments that his journey had given him a unique ability to connect with others, to show them that they weren't alone. His role as a leader didn't stop there. The school's Cultural Awareness Club invited him to join their leadership team, and Aaron eagerly accepted. Together with Emily and a group of passionate peers, he organized events that celebrated diversity and encouraged open dialogue about important issues. From panel discussions to art exhibits, the club's initiatives brought students and teachers together in ways that hadn't happened before. One evening, As Aaron sat at his desk working on plans for the club's next event, his father knocked on the door and stepped into the room. "You've been busy," David said, nodding toward the papers and flyers spread across the desk. Aaron smiled, leaning back in his chair. "There's a lot to do, but it feels good to be part of something bigger." David sat down across from him, his expression proud. "You've come a long way, Aaron. Watching you grow through all of this, it's inspiring." Aaron looked down, his modesty showing, but his father continued, "You've turned a difficult experience into something positive, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. That's the mark of a true leader." Hearing those words from his father meant more than Aaron could express. He had come to understand that growth wasn't just about overcoming challenges, it was about using those challenges to build something better. As the school year progressed, Aaron continued to thrive. He excelled in his studies, participated in extracurricular activities, and deepened the bonds with his classmates. His journey wasn't just about fighting injustice. It was about becoming the person he had always hoped to be. Aaron knew there would always be obstacles in life, but he also knew he had the strength to face them. His experiences at Riverview High had shaped him in ways he hadn't anticipated, turning adversity into a foundation for confidence, resilience, and leadership. He was no longer just the new kid trying to fit in. Aaron had found his voice, and he was determined to use it to make a difference. Word of Aaron's story didn't stay confined to Riverview High. Within weeks, the events in Mrs. Caldwell's classroom and the subsequent changes at the school became the talk of the town. Local newspapers picked up the story, detailing how a student's courage to stand against discrimination had sparked meaningful reforms. Headlines like "High School Student Inspires Change After Exposing Teachers' Prejudice" and "Riverview High Sets Example with Diversity Initiatives" drew attention from neighboring communities. Parents began to take notice. At PTA meetings, discussions about creating safer and more inclusive environments for students took center stage. Many parents, some of whom had never considered how prejudice might impact their children, expressed newfound awareness and commitment to fostering a supportive atmosphere. "I never realized how much a single teacher's behavior could shape a child's experience," one parent said at a meeting. "Aaron's story made me think about the kind of environment my own kids are learning in." Others echoed similar sentiments, sharing stories of their own children's experiences with subtle biases or outright discrimination. It became clear that what happened to Aaron wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger issue that needed addressing. At Riverview High, the ripple effects of Aaron's stand continued to grow. The administration began hosting open forums where students, parents, and faculty could discuss their concerns and share ideas for improvement. These events were well attended, with participants eager to contribute to the dialogue. David Miller, Aaron's father, was often invited to speak at these gatherings. His expertise as a civil rights attorney and his first-hand experience as a parent gave him a unique perspective that resonated with the community. "We can't change the past," he said during one forum, "but we can ensure that what happened to Aaron doesn't happen to anyone else. That requires all of us, parents, teachers, administrators, and students, working together to create a culture of respect and accountability." Lisa Miller also became a prominent voice, advocating for more robust parent-teacher partnerships. "We have to hold our schools accountable," she said at a community meeting. "But we also need to support our educators, giving them the tools and training they need to recognize and address their own biases." Their words struck a chord, and soon initiatives that had started within Riverview High began spreading to other schools in the district. Diversity workshops and anti-bias training became standard for teachers and administrators. Some schools introduced mentorship programs similar to the one Aaron had helped establish, pairing older students with younger ones to foster guidance and support. The story also caught the attention of local businesses and organizations. Community leaders reached out to Riverview High, offering to sponsor events and programs that promoted inclusion. One business owner, inspired by Aaron's story, donated funds to create a scholarship for students who demonstrated leadership in advocating for equity and justice. "I want to invest in the future leaders of our community," she explained. Aaron reminded us all of the power of one voice to create change. Local media outlets continued to follow the story, interviewing Aaron and his peers about the changes taking place. At first, Aaron was hesitant to step into the spotlight. He wasn't used to the attention and didn't see himself as a hero. But over time, he realized that sharing his experience could inspire others to take action in their own schools and communities. "I didn't do this alone," he said during one interview. "My classmates, my parents, and my teachers all played a role in making this happen. Change doesn't come from one person, it comes from a community working together." Aaron's classmates also took the lessons they had learned beyond the school walls. They started organizing events in the broader community, such as town hall meetings and cultural festivals. These events celebrated the town's diversity while fostering dialogue about the challenges that still needed to be addressed. Emily emerged as one of the key organizers, working closely with Aaron to plan a community-wide cultural awareness day. The event featured performances, art exhibits, and workshops aimed at educating attendees about different cultures and perspectives. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," Emily said during a planning meeting. "It's about building something better." The Cultural Awareness Day was a resounding success, drawing hundreds of attendees from across the town. Aaron stood at the center of it all, speaking to visitors, answering questions, and sharing his journey. As he looked around at the vibrant displays and engaged conversations, he felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Even as the community celebrated its progress, it remained committed to ongoing improvement. The school board created a task force dedicated to reviewing policies and ensuring that the lessons learned from Aaron's experience were institutionalized. This group, which included parents, teachers, students, and community leaders, met regularly to assess the effectiveness of the new initiatives and recommend further actions. One of the task force's first successes was the creation of a reporting system that allowed students to anonymously share concerns about bias or discrimination. The system was designed to ensure that every student's voice could be heard without fear of retaliation. "We owe it to our students to make sure their concerns are taken seriously," Principal Carter said during a press conference. "This isn't just about addressing incidents after they happen, it's about preventing them in the first place." As the school year drew to a close, Aaron reflected on how far they had come. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But the changes they had sparked, both at Riverview High and in the broader community, were undeniable. One evening, as he walked through the town square, Aaron noticed a mural being painted on the side of a building. It depicted a group of diverse students standing together, their hands raised in unity. Above them, bold letters spelled out, "Our voices matter." Aaron stopped to admire the mural, feeling a swell of emotion. It wasn't just a tribute to him, it was a testament to what they had achieved together. As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The story wasn't over yet, but he was ready to keep writing it. One step, one voice, and one act of courage at a time. As the school year came to an end, Riverview High was unrecognizable from the place it had been just months ago. The air felt lighter. The students walked with a renewed sense of belonging, and the community was buzzing with hope for the future. The changes sparked by Aaron's courage had not only transformed the school, but also inspired others far beyond its walls. His journey had become a story of resilience, of turning pain into purpose, and of proving that one voice truly can make a difference. In the final assembly of the year, Principal Carter stood before the gathered students and faculty, reflecting on the progress they had made. But the highlight of the event came when David Miller was invited to the stage. As Aaron's father approached the microphone, the auditorium fell silent, every eye fixed on him. David paused for a moment, looking out over the crowd. His presence was commanding, but his tone, when he began to speak, was warm and heartfelt. When my son Aaron first told us about what he was experiencing, I'll be honest, my first reaction was anger, he said. As a parent, it's hard to see your child go through something so unjust, but what I've learned from Aaron is that anger alone doesn't create change. It's what you do with that anger, how you channel it into action, into courage and into hope, that makes the difference. He glanced toward Aaron, who sat near the front, his face a mix of pride and humility. Aaron showed us all what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. He taught us that resilience isn't just about enduring challenges. It's about facing them head-on and refusing to let them define you. The audience listened intently, moved by his words. David continued, his voice steady and deliberate. But Aaron's story isn't just about one student or one classroom. It's a reminder to all of us that change starts with the courage to speak out. Whether you're a student, a teacher, a parent, or a community leader, you have the power to make a difference. He paused, letting his message sink in. And remember this: when you stand up, you're not standing alone. There will always be people who share your vision, who will rally behind you, and who will help carry the weight when it feels too heavy. Together, we can build the kind of world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. The auditorium erupted into applause, the energy electric. David stepped back, nodding toward Aaron, who stood to join him on stage. The father and son exchanged a brief but meaningful look before Aaron leaned into the microphone. "I just want to say thank you," Aaron said, his voice steady. "Thank you to everyone who stood by me, who believed in me, and who chose to speak up when it mattered. This isn't just my story, it's ours. And it's proof that even when things seem impossible, change is always possible if we work together." As the applause swelled again, the students rose to their feet, giving Aaron and his father a standing ovation. The moment was a culmination of everything they had fought for, a victory not just for Aaron, but for every student who had ever felt unseen or unheard. Later that evening, as the school hallways emptied and the sun set over Riverview, Aaron walked past the mural in the town square. Its vibrant colors seemed to glow in the fading light, and the words, "Our voices matter," felt like a beacon of hope. He paused, taking a moment to reflect on how far they had come. His father's words echoed in his mind. Change starts with the courage to speak out. Aaron knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be more to fight for, more work to do. But for now, he felt at peace, knowing that his voice had sparked something bigger than himself. For viewers watching this story unfold, the lesson is clear. Standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's worth it. Aaron's journey is a testament to the power of resilience, community, and the courage to challenge injustice. If you've ever wondered whether one voice can make a difference, this story proves it can. And if this inspired you, don't stop here. Check out our other stories of individuals who turned their struggles into change and found their strength in the face of adversity. Whether it's about standing up to bullies, overcoming the odds, or fighting for what's right, these stories will remind you that the power to make a difference lies in all of us. Because in the end, change starts with you.